What do you think the West should have done in the face of Putin's nuclear threats? How should we respond to nuclear blackmail in a situation like this?
Well, I think the response was made eventually. Eventually, all the things that he was saying will be a red line were issued and lines were crossed, and they turned out to be non-existent. So, the correct policy would have been not to tie yourself up in self-imposed restraint. Because the problem with nuclear blackmail is this. If you invade a country and then say, well, if you do something to stop me, I will use nukes, then what's next? Like, how will it be different if you invade Poland or Germany, right? You have to call this blackmail early on, because otherwise it's, it emboldens more and more blackmail.
I guess it depends on your theory of mind with respect to your enemy. It matters whether you think Putin is totally insane or, otherwise suicidal, right? Or, I think it would be, if we were dealing with a jihadist regime where we were pretty sure all their talk about paradise and loving death more than we love life was honest confession of their worldview, that could change our sense of things.
We have a crucial piece of evidence here. His table in 2021. Somebody
the COVID
who is
table.
Exactly. Somebody who's suicidal, doesn't spend 2 years in isolation and, have this, biggest table in the world with his interlocutors.
Yeah. Yeah. So in that case, I just think, so assuming we're taking the other end of it where, we imagine, I think rightly, that Putin is eager to survive and remain one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest man on earth, and live a good life in some sense. What do you think we should be doing now, even under the shadow of whatever nuclear threats he's making? What sort of help should we give Ukraine? Because you say we've crossed a bunch of his red lines. I'm sure there are ones we haven't crossed. We haven't given them everything we could give them, short of American boots on the ground. What should we do?
Well, if you ask the Ukrainians, obviously the biggest disparity right now is in long-range fire capabilities. The Russians are able to strike targets anywhere in Ukraine with the long-range missiles, and the Ukrainians are prohibited from using foreign weapons to strike anything on Russian soil, which means that if there is an artillery battery firing at Kharkiv from Belgorod across the border, you cannot use American weapons to take it out. You just have to sit there and take the fire. Or you cannot strike a Russian airfield from which they're flying the sorties against Ukraine. So that's one restriction. Another restriction is that it's a partial red line because it's been broken by the UK and France, which have provided Ukraine with cruise missiles that they've used very successfully to take out Russian capabilities in Crimea, for example. But the US and Germany, which have their own, the ATACMS and the Taurus missiles, have still not done that because that could be potentially seen as provocative by Russia, perhaps. So that's sort of going back to the administration. Obviously, the other big stumbling block, and the biggest issue right now, is what's happening in Congress, where even though the Senate has voted to approve military aid for Ukraine with a 70-29 vote, a pretty big majority, in the House, the Speaker refuses to put up legislation to a vote, even though it would have a majority there too. And that means ammunition. And, Ukraine is running out, it's completely outgunned. Russia has, 5-1, maybe 10-1 fire superiority, in part because North Korea very generously provided with more than 1 million shells. And that is already having impact on the ground. Ukraine lost a city for the first time since May last year, the city of Avdiivka, in February, because it didn't have enough shells to hold it, because the U.S. froze aid. The delay, it's been 4 months that the House has been sitting on the funding.
Why have Western sanctions not worked against Russia?
I wouldn't say they haven't worked. They haven't worked sufficiently. And there are several reasons for that. First of all, they are porous. They're not being enforced. If you look at the Russian missiles and drones that are being shot down in Ukraine, they're full of Western components that are somehow getting to Russia through third countries, through the UAE, Turkey, Kazakhstan, Georgia, China, you name it. Russia has found a market for its oil at a discount in places like India, which I'm also happy to have cheap oil. And, there is still Russian gas, flowing to some countries in Europe. So the sanctions have been stronger than they were in 2014, but still quite limited.